They called him the boy with the heavy shadow, a child of misfortune meant only for the dirt. While every man in the village wore his finest lace to impress the billionaire princess, Kamso was sent to the river with a rusted bucket, told that his face would only bring shame to the palace. But fate had other plans. If you're just tuning into this channel, please subscribe, give this video a thumbs up, and don't forget to share with your friends and family, and tell us where you're watching from in the comments section. The story begins in the pre-dawn chill, the silence broken only by the sound of Kamso's ragged broom. With heavy eyes and a rumbling stomach, he scrubs the floors of a home that was once filled with his mother's joy but is now a battlefield of silence and cruelty. The rooster's first cry was a jagged blade cutting through the heavy silence of the pre-dawn chill, but Kamso was already awake, his body a map of aches that never quite healed. He dragged his feet across the dirt compound, the handle of a rusted iron bucket biting into his palm as he moved toward the veranda. Every scrape of his ragged broom against the stone felt like a countdown toward the moment Madame Veronica would emerge, her voice a thunderclap ready to shatter his peace. As the dust rose in the dim light, a stray scent of crushed scent leaves from the garden caught the wind, and for a fleeting heartbeat, the gray world shifted. Suddenly, he wasn't a stray goat scrubbing floors in the cold. He was a child wrapped in the golden warmth of a kitchen that smelled of rich palm oil and seasoned fish. He could almost hear the melodic lilt of Adamma's voice, his mother, the jewel of the village, singing a song that made the very walls of the house feel alive with joy. In those days, the compound didn't feel like a prison. He remembered her gentle hands rubbing oil into his skin, her embrace so full and safe that it seemed no harm could ever reach him. But that warmth was a ghost. The reality that crashed back was the sight of his father, Chief Okafor, sitting like a hollow statue under the mango tree, staring into the nothingness where his spirit used to be. The man who once danced with Kamso in the living room was gone, replaced by a stranger who chewed his stick in a silence so thick it felt like a burial. Now there were no kisses on the forehead, only the biting wind and the looming threat of Veronica's screams. Kamso bent lower, scrubbing harder as a single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek, mourning the boy who was once loved in a house that had forgotten his name. The transition in the household was as swift as it was cruel. When Madame Veronica first arrived, she had been a woman of sugar and smiles, painting over the cracks in the house with fake laughter and promises of a new beginning. She had stroked Kamso's hair and called him her son, a performance that briefly thawed the boy's frozen heart. But the mask shattered the moment her own daughter, Mariam, was born. Suddenly, the sugar turned to salt, and the smiles became a sharp blade that cut Kamso away from the family table. As Mariam grew, fair-skinned and pampered like a delicate doll, Kamso's world shrank into a cycle of unending labor. He was no longer the angel of the house but a stray goat and bad luck, a boy whose only purpose was to serve the whims of his new mistress. Madame Veronica's voice, once soft, now boomed like thunder across the compound, demanding to know why a plate was slightly damp or why the toilet hadn't been scrubbed before the sun had even touched the horizon. Kamso's childhood was buried under the weight of rusted buckets and heavy firewood. The most painful part of the takeover was not the blisters on his hands or the stinging slaps from Veronica, but the absolute silence of his father. Chief Okafor became a ghost in his own compound, sitting under the mango tree and staring into the distance as if his soul had left with his first wife, Adamma. He watched as Veronica took Kamso's school fees and used them to buy Mariam imported toys and silk ribbons, yet he said nothing. When Kamso tried to cry out for help, his father simply adjusted his chewing stick and looked away, leaving the boy to realize that in this new reign, he was truly and utterly alone. The House of Joy had officially become a labor camp, and Kamso was its only prisoner. The sun was a dying ember behind the Irako trees when Kamso approached his father, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Chief Okafor sat in his usual spot under the ancient mango tree, his figure a stark silhouette against the orange sky. He looked like a man carved from the very wood he sat upon, immobile, weathered, and unreachable. Between his teeth was the ever-present chewing stick, the rhythmic scritch-scratch against his teeth being the only sign that he was still anchored to the living world. Kamso stood a few paces away, his hands trembling behind his back. His knees still ached from a day of scrubbing, and his skin bore the faint, stinging heat of Madame Veronica's latest outburst. "Papa," he whispered, the word feeling heavy and foreign in his mouth. The chief did not turn. He didn't even blink. He simply stared into the horizon, as if searching for something that had been buried a long time ago. Stepping closer, Kamso tried again, his voice cracking with the weight of years of neglect. "Papa, the house is cold. Madame Veronica. She says I am a curse. She says I have the shadow of a stray goat." He waited for a flicker of rage, a protective scolding, or even a simple glance of recognition. He longed for the man who used to lift him high and call him the pride of the compound. Instead, the silence stretched, thick and suffocating like the harmattan dust. Chief Okafor slowly pulled the chewing stick from his mouth and spat onto the dry earth. He didn't look at his son, he looked through him. "You should be more respectful," he finally muttered, his voice as dry as withered leaves. It wasn't a comfort, it was a dismissal. That was the chewing stick of silence, a wall of indifference that hurt more than any of Veronica's slaps. Kamso realized then that his father wasn't just quiet. He was gone, replaced by a ghost who refused to see the living. Turning away, Kamso felt the last spark of hope die in his chest. He stopped talking that day, realizing that in this house, his only companion was the shadow they all despised. The news of Princess Ifani's return from America hit Umudike like a sudden thunderclap in the middle of the harmattan season. It wasn't just a arrival, it was a royal hurricane that turned the village upside down overnight. Everywhere Kamso turned, the air was thick with a scent of ambition and imported perfumes as mothers began scrubbing their sons as if they could wash away years of village dust in a single afternoon. The village square, usually a place for quiet trade, became a buzzing hive of royal messengers and frantic preparations. Inside the compound of Chief Okafor, the madness was even more intense. Madame Veronica moved like a woman possessed, her voice booming louder than the royal trumpets as she directed the transformation of the household. "Destiny is walking past our door, and I will not let it pass us by," she screamed, pointing her finger at Mariam, who was already being draped in shimmering silks. To Veronica, the princess's search for a husband was not a romantic quest. It was a business transaction where Mariam was the prize. While the village boys practiced their most sophisticated walks and rehearsed stories of imaginary wealth, Kamso was pushed further into the shadows. "Don't you dare let your bad luck stain this opportunity," Veronica hissed, shoving a heavy water keg into his hands. As the village prepared for a feast of royalty, Kamso was sent to the outskirts, his only companion the rhythmic slosh of water and the distant mocking sound of the royal drums signaling the princess's approach. The world was changing, but for the rejected boy, the burden only grew heavier. The sun was a relentless eye in the sky, baking the red dust of the Umudike road until every breath felt like inhaling embers. Kamso trudged along the path, his muscles screaming from a morning spent hauling Madame Veronica's heavy laundry. His mind was heavy with the insults he had swallowed like bitter pills, yet his spirit remained unbroken. Near the sharp bend that led to the stream, he spotted a figure slumped against the gnarled roots of an ancient Irako tree. It was Mama Ifyananya, her frame so fragile she looked like a collection of dried sticks wrapped in a faded, dusty cloth. A massive bundle of firewood lay scattered beside her, a burden clearly too great for her trembling arms. While other villagers had hurried past, shielding their eyes to avoid the sight of her poverty, Kamso dropped his own keg without a second thought. "Mama, let me help you," he whispered, his voice as gentle as the mother he had lost. He ran to the stream, fetching cool water to wet her parched lips and wiping the grime from her face with his own tattered sleeve. He did not stop there. He hoisted the firewood onto his own head and guided her slowly back to her overgrown compound. Within the hour, Kamso had swept her yard, chopped the wood, and started a small, comforting fire. Mama Ifyananya watched him with eyes that shimmered with an otherworldly light. She reached into her small room and produced a folded wrapper and glowing coral beads. "Take these, my son," she said, her voice sounding like the rustle of silk. "Do not believe the lies they tell you about your shadow. You are a king in servant's rags, and today you have earned a blessing that no man can steal." As Kamso walked away, the heavy weight in his chest felt lighter, as if the old woman's words had finally silenced the echoes of bad luck that had followed him for years. The sun had barely dipped below the horizon when the heavy thud of Madame Veronica's footsteps echoed through the compound, a sound that always signaled the end of Kamso's brief moments of peace. Kamso sat in the dim light of his small room, his fingers tracing the intricate carvings on the wooden box his mother, Adanma, had left behind. Inside, nestled like a secret prayer, lay the shimmering wrapper and the coral beads gifted to him by Mama Ifyananya, the only things he possessed that didn't smell of wood smoke or soot. Suddenly, the door creaked open, and Veronica stood there, her eyes narrowing as they caught the unnatural glow of the coral beads. "What is a stray goat like you doing with royal treasure?" she hissed, her voice a sharp blade in the quiet room. Before Kamso could stand, she lunged forward, her greedy fingers snatching the items from his grasp. She held the wrapper up to the fading light, her face twisting into a mask of triumph as she realized its worth. "This is wasted on a boy who was born under a dark moon," she spat, ignoring Kamso's trembling plea for her to stop. "My daughter, Mariam, is the one destined for the palace. She is the moon that must shine, while you are the dirt she walks upon." Kamso watched in silent agony as his stepmother tucked his only blessing under her arm, claiming his destiny for her own child. As she vanished into the hallway, his room felt colder and darker than it ever had before. He realized then that in this house, even his dreams were not safe from theft. The golden hour had bled into the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and orange as Kamso reached the stream for the 5th time that day. The village was eerily quiet, the distant thrum of palace drums a reminder of the world he was forbidden to join. He bent to dip his bowl, his reflection staring back, gaunt, streaked with soot and weary. "The water is clearer further up," a soft voice remarked. Kamso flinched, nearly dropping his keg. Standing by the cluster of bamboo was a young woman. She wasn't draped in a heavy gold or imported lace he expected of the day's contestants. Instead, she wore a simple cotton wrapper, her hair tied in a modest scarf. Yet, her presence seemed to pull the very light of the sunset toward her. "I'm just a servant, sister. The silt doesn't mind me," Kamso replied with a tired, self-deprecating smile. She stepped closer, her eyes bright with a curiosity that felt like warmth. "And I am just a traveler who is very hungry." Kamso hesitated, then reached into his woven bag, pulling out a piece of roasted yam wrapped in a blackened leaf. "It is not city food, but the sauce has enough pepper to make you forget your troubles." They sat on a flat rock, the billionaire princess, hidden behind the mask of a commoner, and the rejected boy, sharing a meal in the deepening shadows. For the first time in years, Kamso laughed, a sound that felt foreign in his chest as he tried to explain the art of sweeping with a straight back. In that moment, the crown meant nothing and the bad luck was forgotten. They were simply two souls tethered by the smell of wood smoke and the rhythm of the rising moon. The day of the royal visitation arrived with a fever that gripped the entire village, but nowhere was the heat more intense than in Chief Okafor's compound. Madame Veronica moved like a woman possessed, her gold wrapper shimmering with the sweat of her ambition as she barked orders to the caterers and decorators. Under her strict command, Kamso had been driven to the forest at the crack of dawn to gather extra firewood, ensured to be out of sight so his bad luck would not stain the festivities. Inside the main house, Veronica meticulously prepared Mariam, draping her in the heavy, stolen coral beads and the shimmering wrapper that had been meant for Kamso. When the royal convoy finally appeared, heralded by the rhythmic thumping of palace drummers and the arrival of Princess Afani's high-ranking envoy, The air grew thick with expectation. Veronica stepped forward, her face a mask of practiced humility and triumph. She led out Miriam, whose face was completely obscured by a thick, sacred lace veil. "This is the jewel of our house," Veronica proclaimed to the envoy, her voice ringing with a lie that tasted like honey. "She is the one who knelt at the stream to serve, the one whose heart is as pure as the water she fetched for the stranger. She is the bride you seek." Miriam stood stiffly, a silent participant in the theft of her brother's destiny, while the village watched in awe, believing they were witnessing the crowning of a new queen. Veronica smiled at the envoy, convinced that behind the heavy veil, her daughter's stolen glory was now untouchable. The golden veil was lifted, but instead of the joy Madame Veronica expected, a heavy, suffocating silence fell over the compound. Princess Ifeanyi stared at Miriam with eyes as cold as a mountain stream, her regal posture hardening. "This is not the soul I met at the river," she declared, her voice ringing with an authority that made the village elders tremble. Madame Veronica stumbled forward, her face a mask of desperate smiles, insisting that Miriam was the only daughter of the house worthy of a crown. But the princess turned away, her gaze scanning the edges of the crowd where the rejected boy stood in the shadows, his clothes stained with the soot of the kitchen and the dust of the forest. "Kamsachukwu, come forward," the princess commanded, ignoring the gasps of the villagers who had labeled him a child of bad luck for years. As Kamso stepped into the light, his head bowed in habitual humbleness, the princess reached out and took his calloused hands in her own. "You gave me water when I was a stranger and shared your meal when I was hungry. You showed the heart of a king while dressed in the rags of a servant." Turning to the trembling Madame Veronica and the silent Chief Okafor, the princess's voice grew sharp. "You tried to hide your greatest treasure behind a wall of labor and lies, but true royalty cannot be buried in the dirt." In front of the entire village, she draped her own royal shawl over Kamso's weary shoulders, a gesture that signaled his transformation from grass to grace. The worthless boy was no longer a shadow in his father's house. He was the chosen one, honored by the throne, leaving his family to watch in stunned silence as the royal carriage prepared to carry him away from the battlefield of his past toward a future of light.